Good morning and welcome. We are continuing our video devotions to the book of 2 Samuel with 2 Samuel chapter 20 this morning. So we are so glad to have you with us today. Now, I got to be honest with you. I've kind of struggled to come up with anything really to talk about from 2 Samuel 20. And if you've read along with us, you'll probably understand why. It's a pretty straightforward chapter, but there's really not a lot that's that super redeeming, in my opinion, about this chapter. It's an incredibly violent chapter. It's about this man named Sheba, who after David has reclaimed his place as king over Israel, decides to try to lead this rebellion against David that was certainly not successful. And essentially the story ends that when Sheba recognizes that he's going to be overwhelmed by King David, there's no way his rebellion is going to be successful. He tries to hide out in this city, so David sends the army against this city, and instead of being conquered by David's army, they decide that they would turn over Sheba. And the story actually ends with this lady from the city throwing Sheba's head over the city wall so that David's army would leave that city alone. Like I said, it's an incredibly violent chapter, and that's pretty much the extent of the chapter. But what I do want to talk about briefly this morning is that, there are all kinds of stories in the Old Testament, especially like this, that are incredibly violent. In my opinion, they're not overly redeeming. They're just stories about these just brutal conquests that the people of God, even people as holy and righteous as David, would lead to establish their power and their authority on the earth. And, we can understand it because they're a product of their time, and they lived in a world where that was how they demonstrated power, and that was how they kept power, and that was how they proved their authority to the nations, as whoever was the strongest, whoever had the mightiest military. But what's so interesting to me, and what was so interesting, obviously, to early Christians and the Jews that lived during Jesus' time as well, is that when God joined us in the flesh in Jesus, when the Messiah finally came and lived on this earth, he didn't take the form of a military leader like David. He wasn't strong and mighty like David was strong and mighty. He was still strong and mighty, but in a profoundly different way. And we've talked a little bit about how sometimes David demonstrates this type of strength that I'm going to talk about in a second, this willingness to forgive, this willingness to extend grace and mercy. It takes a remarkable amount of strength. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly when you live in a world that was so defined by brute strength and power. But I think there's a lesson for us that we should learn, that when God joined us in the flesh in Jesus, when God dwelled on this earth, he didn't choose to demonstrate his power in the way that David so often demonstrated his power. He didn't choose to overwhelm the people with some military force or some overwhelming sense of authority. He came as a servant. He came as somebody that was willing to forgive, that was always willing to extend grace and mercy, someone that was willing to show their strength through their willingness to love. And I think that's something that's missing in our world today. We live in a world where we're not always encouraged to be loving, particularly to people that are different than us. We live in a world where we're not encouraged to extend grace and mercy and forgiveness, particularly to people who don't deserve it, at least in our eyes. And I hope we recognize just how opposed that is to the example that we get in Jesus Christ. So I know this has been kind of a disorganized and rambly devotion, but if you've read chapter 20, you'll probably understand why it might be difficult to come up with an uplifting devotion based on the narrative of that chapter. But I want us to think about, when we read a text like this and we read of its violence and its aggression and the fact that there's really no redemption in it, how much hope we should find in that when God joined us in the flesh, God didn't choose to demonstrate his power that way. God had a better way to let us know of his power, to let us know of his love, to let us know of his righteousness, and that we can understand how God did that God's power and God's love for us most clearly in Jesus. So we will see you next week for 2 Samuel chapter 21.